So I want to wrap up in kind of setting up and probably kind of giving you a review and helping you think through um, the argument from evil against God and the argument from morality for the existence of God. So I want to talk a little bit about both the structures of argumentation and the basics of both of those arguments. Um, we went into this class, and I've kind of said sometimes straightforwardly and hinted at a lot of times this idea that you know each religion, there are obviously some things in common. We talked about those, and we've looked at those, I think, pretty significantly. Um, but there are differences, and one of the big differences is this question of how does morality itself and the existence of morality relate to the existence of God. Um, so that's what we're going to wrap up with, right? And this only really ultimately matters um, within the Christian context. Uh, um, and I'll get to that more, excuse me, in this discussion. But the argument from evil is interesting because it's one type of argument, and the argument from morality is a very different type of argument, though it draws on the same type that the argument from evil does at a later stage, and I'll explain what I mean. So here we see two basic types of argumentation, right? Deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning says there's an idea. So I take that idea, like all men are mortal, and then I look at an observation. Jason is a man. And so my conclusion is Jason is mortal. Deductive arguments are really logically quite tight. If your basic idea is true and your observation is accurate, then your conclusion is very nearly um, undeniable. Right now, if you think someone's conclusion is wrong, well, you can look at their logic and make sure it's consistent, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Sometimes there are logical fallacies and logical errors where people think they're following deduction, but they haven't defined things well enough, they haven't clarified well enough, and they're actually assuming things that can't be known from what they think is deductively. But if you clearly define everything, and you have this is a sound argument, logically it's sound, right? If all men are mortal and Jason is a man, then Jason is mortal. So if your objective is to argue and say, well, Jason is not mortal, then what do you have to do? You either have to say your observation is wrong, or you have to say your idea at the outset is wrong. So we'll come back to that because that really applies to the argument from morality for the existence of God. Inductive argument is not as tightly locked, right? An inductive argument and is it helps form kind of probabilities. You have a reasonable argument to believe X because of A, B, and C. So induction often starts with observations, right? I break out when I eat peanuts. There's analysis. We know that this can be a symptom of being allergic to peanuts, so probably I'm allergic to peanuts. Now, do I know that for sure? Maybe those peanuts are roasted and seasoned, and I didn't realize it. They're roasted and seasoned in something that I'm allergic to, and those are the only peanuts I've ever eaten. Right? So we can question the observation, we can question the analysis, but in the end, we're looking for a logical theory which has strong reason for being held to, but it's not an absolute. It's not a certainty. If you have a truly sound, and soundness has to do with the logical structure, not necessarily the truthfulness of it. Um, So but if your deductive argument is sound logically, and your idea going in and your observation are true, then the conclusion will be true. It becomes undeniable. With induction, your observations may be pretty good and your analysis may be pretty sound, but your theory could still be wrong. I know a lot of you might think, well, everything should be deductive. We should learn but that's not how we work. That's not how humans. We can't work that way because there's too much that's up in the air, right? One of the reasons that the scientific method tries to isolate things is to limit the scope of the observations in order to help, kind of condense the needed scope of analysis and create theories. That means that induction can lead to kind of stunted theories sometimes, but sometimes that's a necessity for kind of learning new things, for stepping out into new areas, right? So the argument from evil, which is kind of where we'll go, is a inductive argument. It's not deductive. And here's what I mean. The argument from evil looks at the history of life, right? Within the branches of this tree of life that includes sentient beings that could experience pain, there have been millions of species and billions of individuals. They've died, many have suffered in their death. Some species have gone extinct, right? And that's an observation. Okay. Well, you know, then there's this analysis, right? So the arguer from evil against the existence of God says, there exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Number two, an omniscient, holy, good being. Okay, so that's your observation. I'm looking at that world of like all that suffering, all that death, all that extinction, and I'm saying that seems to be right excessive. Why is that? What could possibly, somewhere in that somebody or something that was sentient that could suffered something needlessly, right? And so the analysis says, well, a wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of intense suffering if it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, holy, good being. That's the conclusion, right? That's the theory. Now, this is deductive, so this is not solid. And here's the thing about it, right? Some people who are theists are going to simply say, well, how could you know, number one, what an omniscient, omnipotent being would do or would prevent, right? If it's wholly good, how do you know? How do you know you're not omniscient? You're not omnipotent. There are things that you just can't know, things that you can't understand. So, how do you make that analysis at point two? How do you even know that your observation at point one is true? Right? What might there be some greater good, or some evil worse than that suffering? But this is the basic argument. And I'll come to my questions that I just asked of point one and two in just a minute. But it's important to understand that this is a deductive argument. The strength is on the gut level, right? We've all seen something or experienced something. And if you haven't, you probably will at some point. You'll witness something and you think that's just senseless. It's senseless suffering. Why would that happen to anyone? How could that possibly be? How could God be good, right? If that's going to be the case. What we want is the meaning behind it. What could possibly make any sense? This is this kind of gut level thing. That gut level experience may or may not be true, but it is a shared human experience. And so the argument has this sort of gut level power to it. But one question that needs to be asked when thinking about it is, why do you call that evil? I mean, Socrates, right, in the Gorgias made the case that evil and suffering are not the same thing. But, maybe senseless suffering, maybe the senselessness of it is evil. But why? Where do you get the term evil? What does evil mean? If there is no God, can anything really be evil? Right? Is a predator evil? A lot of that suffering comes from predators, right? Well, um, is it evil for a lion to eat a gazelle? Kills it painfully, eats it. But if it doesn't eat it, the lion might die. So is that evil? Is it evil that there exists a condition in which one creature must kill another creature in order to live? Now, some, Eastern philosophy and even Islam is going to say, no, that's just the balance of nature. And most Eastern philosophies say, look, everything you think is evil is just perspective or it's illusion, so it doesn't really matter. Predators are predators, plant eaters are plant eaters. At the end of the day, it's not evil, it's just the way the world works. Um, Humans are something somehow more deeply connected, more fully connected to the ultimate beyond and shouldn't become predators, but maybe they can be. I mean, it's just, but why do you call it evil, right? The question of what is evil? What makes it evil? Um, why is it evil to cheat someone? Why is it evil to rape someone? Why is it evil for a 3-year-old to die in a stupid accident that happens because somebody's limited and falls asleep behind the wheel of a car? Right? Nobody did anything bad. Why is it evil for a child to get cancer and die of it? Why do you think that evil? It's not evil for the cancer. Cancer is just doing what cancer does. Why do you want to eradicate cancer as an evil? Because you don't like it? Because you might get it? Okay, well, that's self-preservation. But does that make it evil? The term evil, does it have a meaning? Right? And if it has a meaning, what's that meaning? And where do you get the basis? What's the grounding for that meaning? Right? Does it have to do with injustice? Why do you consider it unjust? This is that question that Socrates keeps going back to in all of Plato's writings. What is justice? It's not merely suffering or not suffering. It's not merely getting what you want or not getting what you want. It's not merely doing good for people you like and being mean to people you don't like. That's not justice. In fact, Socrates thinks you should do no harm. Well, if I shouldn't actively do harm, why isn't suffering in itself evil? Right? These are challenging and difficult questions. And if you have the problem of evil as your belief, as your reason for thinking there is no God, then you have to ask yourself, but why do you call it evil? It's just what is. And so, you know, where does that idea of evil come from? Where does think about our pop culture even. We see the predator as less good than the prey, right? All of our cartoons, like, the cat chases the mouse, it's the mouse that we cheer for. We call evil people predators. If you ask us logically, is a lion evil for being a predator? We say, well, no, no, no. But then we use that word predator to describe a person who preys upon other people. Where do we get that concept that it's evil to prey upon others in order to survive for yourself? When you're watching the videos and listening, like David Bentley Hart, like that video, he kind of lays out. He's a theist. He's a type of a Christian. He he, but he says this argument is very strong because it hits us hard. Stephen Fry, right? When Stephen Fry is this comedian, Stephen Fry at one point in an interview he called God an evil, capricious, monstrous maniac, right? Um, he like when he's asked about God, he just goes into this tirade of, how dare God allow all these horrible things, right? And Stephen Fry, I mean, he doesn't believe in God. He thinks that most people are good. He wants to be a better person, right? But how do you describe what does that mean when you say that, right? And I would argue that, quite honestly, most people who believe in a God, I don't believe in the God that Stephen Fry doesn't believe in. Doesn't mean I don't believe in God. Stephen Fry's vision of God is shaped by a sort of reversal of what most believers in God believe. But we have this question: is God a monster? Is he a monstrous, maniacal? Is he out? Um, how would you determine that, right? And when we take along with that, right, if we're talking about evil as predators, right, where do we get the idea of the predator being a figure of evil? Well, quite honestly, it comes from an idea of the lion lying down with the lamb, the bear and the ox. The child can put their hand on a snake and not be bitten. Where does that beautiful vision of no death, no rending, no tearing, no predators, no prey, where does that come from? Well, that comes from the Bible. It's a Christian ideal. Furthermore, Rowe, when he's talking about the argument from evil, the 3 points we saw, Rowe goes on to add, he says, when children are ill and confined to a hospital, the loving parents, by any means possible, seek to comfort their child, giving special assurance of their love, while he is separated from them and suffering for a reason he does not understand. No loving parents use their child's stay in the hospital as an occasion to take a holiday, saying to themselves that the doctors and nurses will surely look after little Johnny while they are away. Many human beings have endured horrendous suffering without any awareness of God's assurance of his love and concern during their period of suffering. He goes on to say, my own inclination is to think that given the horrendous evils in our world, the absence of the God who supposedly walked with Adam and Eve in the garden is evidence that there is no God. Notice again, this is that inductive, not deductive. For surely if there was a God, he would wish to provide us with strong reasons to think that he exists. Given that there are horrendous evils in our world, both natural and moral, seem to provide us with reason to doubt his existence. There again, evils in the world. What do you mean by evil? How do you ground that? That you don't like them? Is that what makes them evil? Evil, moral, those types of things seem to be grounded in something beyond. So this is a challenge. I would say another challenge for Rowe's parent analogy is that many people claim comfort from God. Precisely the comfort that Rowe says isn't there. So the question is, if you deny the existence of God and therefore don't feel the presence of God, and then you complain that God isn't there when you have suffering, is that a fair complaint? Might there be something more good or stopping a greater evil that would explain why, for the person that doesn't necessarily seek God's comfort or believe in God's comfort, might there be something in the world that's worth the suffering, um, in and of itself, with or without comfort? What might that something be? I would argue, number one, that I've known tons of people who believe they had comfort from God in the midst of great suffering. But number two, even when the comfort doesn't seem to be there, there may be something that we all value that's worth the suffering. And I would argue that that's freedom. That would be part of the Christian argument. Um, and if we have this discussion, um, if you choose this kind of for your final project, we'll talk more about that freedom. But the idea that um, humans are fully human and fully able to love only if they're free to make choices. But to be free to make choices means free to screw things up, which means free to cause suffering. So that if God wants people to be free, then If everyone is free, then everyone has the option of doing things that could cause harm, that could create imbalance in the natural order, that could create problems. And this is typically one of the Christian answers to both the basic argument and this parent analogy, right? That God is there. He does offer comfort. He does walk with people through their suffering. He's willing to allow the suffering and walk with people through it because human freedom is a value in itself. Now, all of that, though, even the idea that if God, right, where do you get this idea, right? This idea of God, the horrendous evils in our world, the absence of God who supposedly walked with Adam and Eve. Wait a second, notice something. This is not the God of Hinduism. This is not the God of Taoism. This is not the God, even necessarily, in some sense, it's not necessarily the God of Islam. Rowe's parent analogy only applies, and I would argue the argument from evil against God only applies to the Christian God. That's why I pull and draw upon C.S. Lewis and others when we address the issue of morality and God, because that really is just a Christian question. For the Jews, for Judaism, God is ultimate. God knows everything. God is not obliged to you. You humans are obliged to figure it out. For Jews, freedom is the ultimate thing. God sets you free. The community is free together to determine for itself what needs to be understood and what needs to be done. It is the arbiter for the law. Within Christianity, freedom exists for the sake of love. God is love. But if you think that God is love, and God is the loving God, or should be the loving God who walks with Adam and Eve, and his failure to comfort you bothers you, you're arguing against a thoroughly Christian God. So that's another point to keep in mind. Both the argument from evil and the argument for God from morality are really primarily and only Christian arguments. They don't apply the same way in other religions. This is one of the big differences. And I'm not saying that other religions don't believe in God, right? What I'm saying is the atheistic argument that God can't exist because of suffering, because of evil in the world. It really is not an important argument for Muslims. It's not an important argument for Hindus or Buddhists or Taoists. It is an argument targeted specifically and primarily at Christians, potentially at Judaism. Which takes us to this discussion of an introduction of the other argument, the argument from morality for the existence of God. Now, a lot of people, and I use this, I put this up there because this is pretty common. You see this. If God does not exist, then everything is permissible, Fyodor Dostoevsky. I've read Brothers Karamazov. This concept in this discussion is Ivan, the atheist brother in Brothers Karamazov, has a discussion around this idea, and I'm thinking, I don't think he actually said it. I think it's Jean-Paul Sartre says he said it because Dostoevsky's work converses around this concept, right? So it's not to say that Dostoevsky shouldn't be credited with addressing and wrestling with this. I don't know that it's a direct quote. In fact, most places that I've looked, it's a thick book, and it's a translation, right? It was written in Russian. I don't read Russian. I don't have any Russian scholar friends to ask if it actually says it, but the idea is there. The atheist brother in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov wrestles with this idea. If God does not exist, then everything is permissible. I mean, think of, our Jeffrey Dahmer quotes, right, that we had earlier in this semester. Once he realized that there was no God, he realized he could do whatever he wanted to get whatever pleasure he wanted. This is the idea that Dostoevsky's wrestling with through his two brothers, Ivan and I think it's Alyosha. Um, Alyosha is the Christian, Ivan is the atheist, right? And they're having this debate. But whether Dostoevsky actually said it, he definitely didn't say it quite so plainly, but this has become the basis for a lot of people's discussion around morality, objective morality, and the existence of God. So this argument seems, at least on the surface, to be more deductive. The idea is, right, if there is no God, then there is no objective morality. And then, according to the arguers for God, but there is objective morality, therefore there must be a God. This is kind of the point that they're doing. This is why it's deductive in its structure. Now, you'll remember, right, Kahane article on evolution, um, or Sam Harris talking about moral landscape. What are they trying to do? They're trying to destroy the beginning idea. They're trying to say, wait a second, I can show you objective morality without God, and if I can do that, then your argument falls apart. So that's why they take that route. Others have said, no, 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 there's no objective morality. You just think there's objective morality. You just think there's an ought. So that's where the arguments often happen. But if the statement, logically speaking, if the idea that there's no objective morals apart from God, which a lot of atheists will say, if there are no objective morals apart from God, is true, then if you observe genuinely objective morals, then you must conclude that there is a God. That's pretty logically sound. It's hard to defeat logically. So the argument is going to be on those two. Are there objective morals? Or, is that initial idea true? This works because of very basic logic, right? It's a conditional statement. If A, then B, right? It usually looks like that there, the A arrow B, right? If A, then B. Means if A is true, then B will be true. If that logical statement is true, then that is, then you can know whenever you have A, you will have B. Now, logically speaking, the contrapositive is logically equivalent. What do I mean? So if you don't have B, then you know that you didn't have A, right? So now you can have B without having A, but you can't have A without B. That's what a conditional means. So the converse is not logically equivalent. Right? So if B, then A does not come out of logically if A, then B. And I'll get to some examples of why in just a second. For the converse to be true of the conditional, then it must be it's not a conditional, it's a biconditional. It means it goes both ways, if and only if. I'm going to spend a lot of time on that. I mostly want to focus on the conditional and the contrapositive because that's what's important for the basic argument from morality for God. But here's what I mean. So if A, then B, right? If it's a dog, then it has four legs. If it's raining, then John carries an umbrella. Here's why the converse is not true, right? If it's a dog, it has four legs. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if it has four legs, it's a dog, right? A horse has four legs, a cat has four legs. But if it does, and we can, obviously a dog could have a leg cut off, but they're talking naturally, normally, under normal conditions. If you see something that crawls on its belly through the movement of scales, it is clearly not a dog, right? If you see something walking all the time upright on two legs with hands and an opposable thumb, it is not a dog, right? So if A, then B, right? Anytime you have A, you will have B. If it's another one is if it's raining, John carries an umbrella. Now it could be that John carries an umbrella every day without fail. And so whether it's raining or not. You can't say, oh, John has this umbrella, it's raining today. Well, no, maybe not. John may carry his umbrella every day. But if John carries his umbrella every day, he will have one when it's raining, right? That's what a conditional means logically. The contrapositive, the reversal, is equivalent. Like I said about the dog, if you see something that naturally does not have four legs, it has two legs and two hands, or it crawls around on its belly. Like, so if it doesn't know four legs naturally, then it is not a dog. Or if you see John without an umbrella, you can know it is not raining, right? If he's obviously no human is that consistent, but point being, right? Logically speaking, contrapositive is logically equivalent to the conditional. It's important to understand that, right? Because when we talk about this argument from if there's no God, then there are no objective moral values, right? So you're starting with a negation. You're starting with not B, then not A. So when you negate not, right, no objective moral values, then you're negating not no God. That's a double negative. It can get confusing, but just realize like a double negative means a positive. So if there's not no objective moral values, then there are objective moral values. And if there are objective moral values and there's not no God, there is a God, right? That's why I wanted to show you that. So if there's no God, then there are no objective moral values. Objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. This is the basic moral argument for God right here. Rooted in that idea we saw in Dostoevsky and in Jean-Paul Sartre. Various atheists and theists make that claim. Like I said, your Sam Harris, your Kahane, they're trying to make a case that actually there can be objective moral values apart from God. That they're trying to say that this conditional statement is untrue because this is not true. If the observation, the objective moral values do not depend upon God. They're trying to give you another grounding for objective moral values. Most atheists historically have said, no, there are just no objective moral values. Therefore, there's no God. But then others have come back and said, well, no, there are objective moral values. Here they are. You observe them. You see them. This argument takes a deductive structure, but at the end of the day, it has this sort of inductive strength because it's hard to absolutely confirm the relation of the first premise, number one. And it's hard to absolutely confirm the objective moral values, though, but they are pretty strong. It's a very strong inductive argument with a sort of deductive structure. So when you watch, if you haven't watched already, when you watch C.S. Lewis's argument, what you're going to see is him making a moral argument as a sort of hint to something more. He's saying he's starting out by trying to prove to you that you really do believe in objective morals, that you can't deny them. And therefore, if there are objective morals, they have to come from somewhere. He's trying to flesh out this very basic argument. This very basic argument is logically sound. He's trying to prove all the points in the syllogism so that once you know that they're all true, then you have to admit to the truth that God exists. And he eventually wants to take you to the understanding of why it needs to be the Christian God. In part because it really doesn't matter for the other gods. So hopefully that helps you as you kind of navigate this. We'll flesh these out more in your individual discussions with me on Zoom. Don't forget to set your appointment. I'll put more about that in Blackboard.